In an age of instant communications, when the image and the voice are so important and so available for constant and continuous study, the chief occupant of the White House has almost certainly become the most exhaustively analyzed figure of modern times. To most Americans, the office of the presidency is a repository of a nation's hopes, its dreams. To observers, columnists, broadcasters, and historians, the modern president is not only the chief executive, he is also the commander-in-chief, the administrator of a vast bureaucracy, is government's top diplomat, educator, economist, and originator of legislative programs. Combined with this endless galaxy of functions that graphically illustrate the obligations of his office, the electronic eye and the speed of 20th century air travel have brought him closer to the public than any other man of his time. Measured against his own deeply personal terms, the events of December 1967 would quickly become household happenings for most citizens of the world. On December 7th, President Johnson joined over 3,000 mourners at New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral as they paid their final respects to Francis Cardinal Spellman. As pastor and statesman, Cardinal Spellman had been an apostle of progress whose influence had been felt whenever problems touched his pulpit or his world. As vicar of the armed forces, his support of the administration's efforts in Vietnam had been strong and clear. His was a voice that would be missed.
Wilt thou love him, comfort him, honor and keep him in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live? Who giveth this woman to be married to this man? Her mother.
Two days after his return from New York, the president's oldest daughter, Lyndon Johnson, became the bride of Captain Charles Robb of the United States Marine Corps. Historically, it was the first White House wedding in 53 years, and certainly one of the most brilliant social events since the East Room wedding of Alice Roosevelt Longworth in 1906. From Washington or the Texas White House, few moves are as characteristic of the Johnson presidency as the weekend political foray or the one-day barnstorming tour through several states. December 12th was no exception. First stop, Killeen, Texas, for dedication ceremonies that marked the opening of the Ovita Culp Hobby Library at Central Texas College.
So let us show by our actions that progress and movement forward in America is not too expensive. What is expensive?
Departing frequently from his text, the president rejected the notion that America could not solve her own problems of poverty and educational excellence. Both would succeed if the American people had the courage to stay the course. 3 hours later, in the George C. Marshall Space Center in Michaud, Louisiana, he defended America's 10-year, $20 billion investment in space exploration. Then, that evening, before a national television audience and 2,500 union delegates to the AFL-CIO convention in Val Harbor, Florida, the president readied a preview of some dominant themes for 1968. Citing the mass of legislation extracted from Congress since he took office, he made a spirited appeal for the passage of other needed programs, defended his policies in Vietnam, and called on labor for restraints to avoid a wage price spiral. But the main thrust of his talk concerned the Republicans in Congress, whom he called the wooden soldiers of the status quo. Despite what one critic called the unjust hyperbole of his attack on the Republicans, the president could claim with considerable accuracy that the majority of bills enacted in the past 4 years had grown from administration proposals.
It wasn't easy, every step of the way. There were voices and there were votes that said, no, no, not so fast. It's only a rehash of the old New Deal or the New Frontier. It costs too much money. And don't you know there's a war on? And you'll have to stop progress here at home. I have heard them all. And together we have answered them all.
The 90th Congress's first session had reflected the contention over Vietnam and the urban crises. Nevertheless, the congressional machinery had managed to finance the war, keep the important domestic programs going, and pass some key legislation. Included in the bills passed, the largest increase in Social Security benefits in the program's 32-year history, the operational funding of the Model Cities concept, a new rat control program, and expanded federal jurisdiction over the control of air pollution. Even more remarkable was the recent history of consumer legislation. With the passage of the Wholesome Meat Act, the full record would show more accomplished consumer legislation in a 2-year period than in all of the other 88 Congresses combined. One of the honored guests for the bill's signing on December 15th was author Upton Sinclair. As a young man, his articles and books had been the first real attacks on the gruesome horrors of the slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants in America.
I have heard them all, and we have answered them all. Our answer is, yes, it is for labor. Yes, it is for the young and the old and the worker and the businessman, the farmer and the teacher, and the student and the patient and the doctor. Our fight is not for part of America. Our fight is for all of America.
At the traditional lighting of the national Christmas tree, the President and the First Lady joined the nation in celebrating the holiday season. larger enterprises that shape history take a great deal of time and hard work. The Kennedy Round was such an enterprise. After 5 years of very careful and difficult negotiations, a series of agreements were signed in Geneva during the summer of 1967. The President's signature on Proclamation 3822 on the morning of December 16th challenged the members of the Kennedy Round to the now critical test of trade cooperation.
Beginning January the 1st, our tariffs on many of the products that we import will drop in the first of what will be 5 annual reductions. Our trading partners will take equivalent action on their tariffs too. This will mean bigger export sales, we hope, for American businessmen and American farmers. Those who negotiated at Geneva drove a hard bargain, but we believe it was a fair bargain.
In early December, the White House announced that the First Family had decided to spend Christmas Day in Washington. Coupled with this was the news at mid-month that the President had videotaped an interview with the White House correspondents from the 3 major television networks. The informal session, the first for the President since 1964, was due for playback in prime time on the evening of the 19th. Its expected audience, close to 52 million viewers. On the 18th, the day of the taping, Washington and the world received sudden and tragic news. From the moment that the wire service teletypes in the White House had clattered out their messages about Prime Minister Holt, there was little doubt that the President's holiday plans would undergo drastic change. Just how drastic, few really knew, until the morning of the 19th. In less than 24 hours, an entourage of 4 jet planes, including Air Force One, and 300 newsmen and aides had been assembled for the trip to Australia. As one reporter put it later, it was a dramatic demonstration of the resources available to an American president and his readiness to put them to use. Behind all the headlines was a simple act of homage to a trusted friend. At stake was the need to reaffirm this country's bond with the Australian people, to impress both the Allies and the Communists with the steadfastness of the American commitment in Asia. The first refueling stop in the 26-hour flight to Canberra was Travis Air Force Base in Northern California. Among the servicemen and dependents who came out to meet the President was one charmer who caught his eye, 4-month-old Madeline Green. At the base hospital, he spent the greater part of an hour talking to some of the wounded veterans just back from South Vietnam. Then at 2:05 p.m. California time, Air Force One sped over San Francisco's Golden Gate.
The gathering together here in Australia of leaders from North and East and West tells much of the kind of man that Harold Holt was, of the kind of leadership that he brought so freshly and so forcefully to the community of free nations, and of the kind of world that he was helping to shape.
By way of welcome to Canberra, Prime Minister Holt's interim successor, John McEwen, assured President Johnson that despite the change in leadership, there would be no change in Australia's commitment in South Vietnam. Following their 90-minute briefing on the war, President Johnson plunged into an 18-hour day of protocol and courtesy visits, and a full round of bilateral discussions with Australian and Asian leaders.
On the periphery of the Orient, a new Asia is now building. I saw it. I went there last year. I visited their countries and their people. And as the new Asia becomes a reality, there is a decent hope that the people on the mainland will also turn their minds to the challenge of economic and social development. There is a decent hope that they will turn to the task of living in dignity and mutual respect with their neighbors.
On Friday, December 22nd, the scene shifted southward to Melbourne, with its somber crowds and church bells pealing from the Gothic spires of St. Paul's Cathedral.
While his days were cruelly short, his vision was long. He saw that we had to begin now to build a new community in Asia and in all the Pacific, a community of nations dedicated together to the works of progress and the fulfillment of all their peoples. A sense of that community already is coming into being among us. Other men and other leaders will carry that cause forward in this and all the other lands that rim this great ocean. But history is going to reserve a very honored place in its memory for the name and for the role of Harold Holt. At a critical time, it was he that saw the vision, and was he that assumed the leadership, and was he that imbued us all with a new spirit and with a fuller faith.
Following the visit to Australia, a curtain of secrecy suddenly and quietly enveloped the presidential caravan. And as it did, speculation over the next touchdown point began to mount. Just before 11 o'clock on the evening of the 22nd, the presidential party arrived at the air base in Korat, Thailand, home of the 388th Tactical Fighter Wing and principal takeoff point for the Air Force's F-105s, making daily combat runs over North Vietnam. After a 4-hour rest, the president walked to the jet tarmac for a pre-dawn meeting with the pilots and crews on the ready line.
I know that at this season of the year especially, I bring with me the love of your families and the affection of your friends who are thinking of you, who are all praying for your safekeeping every waking hour. I bring with me also the gratitude of the nation that you serve so honorably and so loyally and so well. Through the use of air power, a mere handful of you men are pinning down several 100,000, more than 500,000 North Vietnamese. They are increasing the cost of infiltration, and air power is providing the mobility which meets and which matches the stealth of an enemy whose tactics are based on sudden hit-and-run tactics. Let no man in any other land misread the spirit of America. It is a spirit that is manifest in the steadfastness and the resolve
of a nation that is holding firmly and faithfully to its course. So as I meet you and greet you this morning, I say on behalf of your families and your friends, on behalf of all the American people and our allies, God bless you. God keep you, every one of you, and we shall always be deeply in your debt. Thank you and good morning.
Once over the Asian mainland, the president's next stop seemed almost inevitable.
I wish I could have brought you something more than just myself. I wish I could have brought you some gift that would wrap up the care and the concern of your families and your loved ones. I wish I could have brought you, too, some sign that the struggle that you're in will soon be over. I can bring you the assurance of what you have fought to achieve. The enemy cannot win now in Vietnam. He can harass, he can terrorize, he can inflict casualties while taking far greater losses himself. But he just cannot win. There must have been times that you wished that this cup might pass from you, that it might have come in some other place, at some other time, or to some other generation. But it didn't. It came here, and it's with us now. You've taken it with courage that makes all of your countrymen proud of you. And I pray that you will be strengthened this Christmas Day in wartime by the love of your loved ones and your people, by the great confidence that you are inspiring in other people, and by your own great steadfast courage. Now may God bless you, and may God keep each of you.
So, on December 23rd, for the second time in less than 14 months, the president had come to South Vietnam. To the reporters on the scene, one idea that had attended each arrival and departure since the beginning of the trip was that President Johnson might seek an audience with Pope Paul VI in Rome. If this was true, then so was the possibility of an around-the-world flight. Six hours and 30 minutes after his takeoff from Cameron Bay, President Johnson landed in Karachi, Pakistan, for an hour-long meeting with President Ayub Khan. After reviewing Pakistan's rapid progress in agriculture and industrial development, the two presidents discussed the world situation and the prospects for peace in Vietnam. There was much more to talk about, but time was short. With the engines of Air Force One again whining on the airstrip, indications now pointed toward Rome and the completion of an around-the-world journey.
A few hours later, I sat with His Holiness Pope Paul in his Vatican study. I wanted to tell him that the United States had been actively seeking an end to the war in Vietnam, that we had traveled dozens of roads in search of peace, but that thus far these had proved fruitless journeys. His Holiness told me of his eagerness to help bring peace to Vietnam. I felt once more what all the world knows, the human sympathy, the passion for peace that fills the heart of the Pope.
So, after 110 hours, 59 of them in the air, the journey around the world came to an end on Christmas Eve, and the President came home to Washington.
It was a wonderful Christmas. Our first Christmas with our grandson, little Lynn, and the first Christmas that our family had spent together at the White House.
During the remaining days of December, the President and his family returned to Texas. On the agenda was a meeting with the South African heart surgeon, Dr. Christian Barnard, and a series of conferences on a budget message and the State of the Union with key aides and legislators. Slowly but surely, the pulse of the presidential calendar would again start to quicken.